evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's program, An Evening About Israel with Ben Freeman. I'm Bruce Palmer, president of the Jewish Federation. We are thrilled that you are here with us as we celebrate, learn, and discuss Israel, Zionism, and our Jewish pride. Federation is honored to continue to provide engaging and substantive Israel-related programming to our community. Israel is a core part of our federation movement, both locally and nationally. And just recently, our community has had some very exciting Israel-related experiences. Just weeks ago, 3 of our young leadership cabinet members returned from a 10-day mission with over 100 other Jewish leaders from across the country. We have just celebrated Israel's 74th birthday, and we currently have 2 executive committee members en route to Israel, where they will visit the construction sites for the 3 bomb shelters that our community finances and raised money for. This is all very exciting. And while I could go on, and I don't want to keep you all here all night, so it's with great pleasure I introduce to you Deputy Consul General to Israel for the Northwest region, Matan Zamir. Matan and the Consul General's office have been tremendous partners of ours, and we are grateful that he could join us here tonight. Matan.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Dawn. Thank you, Willie, for inviting me, and for the Federation and the community for both inviting me and also for the amazing work that you do around Israel. Bruce, you've mentioned some of the things that you're doing, strengthening the sister city relationship with Ashkelon. Today actually is a special date because exactly a year and 1 day ago, so May 10th of last year, rockets were fired from, it was the first day of Guardian of the World. So those rockets were fired from the Gaza Strip to Jerusalem for 11 days. Most of those rockets fell around Ashkelon, Sacramento's sister city in Israel. And the Federation did 2 amazing things. One, you were one of the clearest voices and the fastest voices to condemn Hamas's actions, those rockets and the aggression towards Israel. And you'll be surprised how many, we heard condemnation voices from the United States, from Federation, from communities, but you were very much on the front of the line on that, and how many voices we have not heard, even though, for us, it might be an obvious thing to condemn act of terrors. And you didn't stop there. So it wasn't just condemnation. You asked us, and we worked together. You asked us, what can we do? And you've organized an amazing campaign to fundraise for those bomb shelters that you have built in Ashkelon to, God forbid, we don't have to use them, but in case something like that happens again, those bomb shelters the people of Ashkelon will use them. And then one more thing that was personally for me was amazing to see is that 2 years ago, in the midst of the pandemic, Israel has sent for the first time firefighters to California to help fighting those crazy large-scale fires that, just one of them were pretty much the size of the state of Israel. And they came to help their brothers in Cal Fire. And they were in a place called Red Bluff that I was surprised that it is even a place, but it is a place. I learned that this place actually exists. But you and the Federation helped sending them food for a Shabbat dinner for them to feel at home, even if they're in Northern California fighting fire. The Federation came together, thanks to your leadership, and helped them feel at home, and I was the one driving to Sacramento and then driving to Red Bluff and giving them those meals. And it was very, very significant and emotional for me. So I want to again, one more time, say thank you to the work that you do around Israel. There's a long list of other examples, and you mentioned some of them, Bruce. The second thing I'll say briefly, because Ben Freeman is the main course of the evening. I'm just the appetizer. Since we have celebrated Israel's 74th birthday last week, this is an opportunity to, look at Israel and understand, where Israel is today compared to 74 years ago. And I don't think I'll be exaggerating if I say that Israel is a miracle. If you look at Israel 74 years ago, and if you look at Israel today, and we can say it because it is Israel's birthday. It was last week, but every other day of the week in Israel, the national sport is to criticize ourselves and to criticize the government. And I know that here in the US, we share the same national sport. But on the occasion of the birthday, we can look at Israel today and not just the high tech, and not just the innovation, and not just the tourism aspect of things and the beauty of the country, but also Israel's society and where Israel's society has become in terms of the diversity, the pluralism. And again, we can be critical, but if you look at Israel today and how diverse and how open Israel has become, I think we can all agree that this is a miracle. So I encourage all of you, if you haven't been in a few years because of the pandemic, the time to go is now. And I think Ben Freeman is a good example of what I just said, of the amazing society and diversity that Israel has to offer. So that's my segue to give it back to you, Willie, to introduce the keynote speaker.
Thank you, Matan. We appreciate it. And, we're really grateful for our partnership with your office and the Consul General's office and your support of our support for Israel and our region. It means a great deal. And, we've been tremendous partners in this work. It's now my pleasure to actually introduce Alex Zachary. Alex is the Israel Fellow at Hillel in Davis. And I'm really glad Alex could be here with us this evening. And so, Alex, I'm going to turn it over to you for a few moments.
Of course. Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be here. And I'm always super happy to meet new people. And hi, Ben. Hi, everyone. And so I'm Alex, the Israel Fellow at UC Davis. And I'm about to finish my first year here, and it was a great year. I didn't even expect it to be. When you come to a foreign country to work on your first time of your life, so you don't really know what to expect, but it was full of diverse experience, and especially to get the students like post-COVID time when they're like anxious and so happy to interact with people, to get to know each other. So like the energy here on campus, it was like really hard to describe, and just to invite them to coffee dates and get to know them better, and providing them the support they needed for someone to listen to them when they're having like challenges on campus, on personal life. And so it was really interesting and developing for me personally. Also, the challenge and the privilege to educate people about Israel. I was very honored and to lead the Israel Learning Fellowship. It's an educational program we ran with MTF, the Maccabi Task Force. It's like a course, educational course about Israel with 8 meetings. Each time the students have chose different topics, different themes that I, as Israeli, provided, if it's like education in Israel or innovation or IDF and my story as a combat soldier and LGBTQ in Israel. So like really diverse topics, and just to provide them some knowledge and get to know and get them closer to Israel. Sorry. I'm so sorry. And
okay.
beside of my work with the students, like educate them, I mentoring Aggies for Israel and Michelano, which is like 2 big pro-Israelis group on campus. One of them is more political, the other one is more like cultural, but to help them run events and express themselves and bring Israel to the students, but through students, not from some one like foreign person who is coming and lecturing them. So that was a great thing as well. And just during the year, expose the students to culture, to diversity in Israel, through dinners, to speakers with different heritage, and forcing our American chef to cook Tunisian sandwich, which he never made, but because it's what I know from Israel, so it was important for me to bring it here. And all those like small events and small interaction build their path to the Israel Week that we were celebrating last week, which was really fun and challenging as well. We started with like educational program and educational movies, some discussion. Then we were mentioning the Memorial Day, which is very emotional for Israelis. And in this, like to bring my personal story as a daughter to a fallen soldier and to talk about what this day means to me in front of the students was very deep. And later on to explain them the insane idea of graving in the morning, but then to celebrate our existence in the country in the evening, and which is a very challenging thing, but just to bring them closer to whatever I know from my hometown and from Israel. Yeah, so we were celebrating here. And I think during this specific week, I just realized the importance and what's the main purpose of Israeli on campus is just to be there, just to be the Israeli, to encourage the students to get the culture, to be vocal, to be present, to humanize Israel, to build collaborations with students, build coalitions, and empowering the students, be there, support Israel with me, not to be ashamed of anything. And yeah, just to give the right proportions to like small events that might intimidate other people. Yeah, so that's was my year here. And if you have any questions, please, you can feel free to ask. And if not, that was me and my year.
Alex, thank you so much. That was great. And thank you for what you do. I don't know if there could be a more important and critical time to have, you on a college campus, on, the Davis campus doing what you're doing. So thank you. And I also want to thank Hillel. The Federation's grateful we can support Hillel and support all the work that they do. They are tremendous partners in this work. And I also want to give a shout out and a nod to Simone Naftalin and Rachel Darling too, who really help many amazing things take place. So thank you for what you do. Before we move on, I want to thank a few people, and I really want to thank our sponsors for the evening who have helped make this evening possible. And I want to thank Sandy and David Fawn. Sandy actually introduced me to Ben, put him on my radar, and we've been looking for a way for 4 or 5, 6 months to bring him to our community, and I'm grateful that we could bring him here tonight. So thank you, Sandy and David, for introducing me to Ben, and also for your generous support of this, and also to Tammy and Michael Rochman. Thank you both for your continuous support and helping to make programs like this possible. We really, really appreciate it. So now, as Matan said, we're on to the main course. So I want to introduce Ben Freeman. I want to talk a little bit about him and let you know who you'll be hearing from. And then I'm going to introduce Don Gilbert too, our Vice President of the Federation Board, who will be asking questions of Ben with me. I'll do a little housekeeping after the introduction, but tonight we are going to hear from Ben Freeman. Ben Freeman is a Jewish leader, a Jewish thinker, and a Jewish educator. Born in Scotland, Ben is a gay, Jewish, internationally renowned author, educator, and diversity, equity, and inclusion specialist focusing on Jewish identity, combating Jewish hatred, and raising awareness of the Holocaust. A Holocaust educator for over 15 years, Ben has come to international prominence during the Corbin Labor Jew hate crisis and quickly became one of his generation's leading voice against anti-Jewish racism. He is the founder of Modern Jewish Pride Movement and the author of Jewish Pride Manifesto, Jewish Pride, Rebuilding a People, released in February 2021 to great international acclaim. He has since decided to create a Jewish Pride trilogy, and his follow-up, Jewish Pride, Reclaiming Our Story, is due out in October of 2022. Part 3 and the finale of Ben's trilogy will be released in 2024. As a specialist in the field for over a decade, Ben is a prominent thought leader on Jewish education, history, and identity, and carries out speaking engagements all over the world. This is true. He is a Jewish diplomat for the World Jewish Congress and a research fellow for the Institute for the Study of Global Anti-Semitism and Policy. He is a trained teacher and experienced lecturer in facilitating unique learning experiences for his students. Through his work, he aims to educate and inspire and empower both Jewish and non-Jewish people all over the world. We're very fortunate tonight to have Ben with us. I'm fortunate to have Don Gilbert, both on our board and as my partner this evening in just talking with Ben. And just if anybody has questions, you are welcome to put them in the chat. We have some questions for Ben, but we will also be taking some other questions. So you are welcome to do that. So without further ado, I turn it over to Don. Don, you're on mute.
That's the only time in my life I've ever been muted. Okay, thanks, Willie, and great to have you here, Ben, and see you again. We really appreciate you spending some time this evening with us. I read your book, the first of the 3. I look forward to reading the other 2. And, my impression from the book, a lot of impressions, actually, even from the 3-page prologue, I probably had 20 questions just from that. But it seems like a very personal book for you. It probably felt good to write it, at least some of it. Others more difficult, I guess. But in the prologue, you say this is a call for Jewish pride, which I think is a strong statement. And it'd be nice to hear you talk about, the concept of pride in general for you, and in particular, Jewish pride.
Absolutely. So thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be here. It's amazing. You guys are in Sacramento. I'm in Hong Kong. There are Israelis. It really speaks to the global Jewish family, this event. So for me, Pride was a journey that began with regards to my gay identity. I'm also a gay man, and I'm about 35 years old. So I was brought up at a time which was much less accepting of LGBTQ plus people as we are now, as it is now. And I had periods of ill mental health because of the pressures I felt, because of internalized homophobia, because of homophobia from the world around me. And I realized something quite radical, probably when I was about 19 or 20. And that realization came from a feeling that I had that I'd never felt before. And I felt angry. I felt angry that I was suffering in this way. I felt angry that I was being punished for a crime I hadn't committed. And those feelings of anger led me to understand that I had done nothing wrong. I was just a gay teen in Glasgow, Scotland, trying to understand who I was, and I was being made to feel less than, I was being made to feel inferior. And that started me on the road to gay pride, to LGBTQ plus pride. Now, with regards to Jewish pride, when I kind of started investigating this, I already had a framework. I already had done the work. I already been on the journey. But really, my journey to Jewish pride began in 2018. And that was during the Labour-Corbyn Jew hatred crisis. I have been proud of being Jewish my whole life. Growing up in Glasgow in Scotland, it was a very Zionist, very Jewish community. When you entered into my home, you were leaving a Scottish street and entering into a Jewish home. And it was very evident that we were from a distinct culture and civilization. But I had never really thought about it that much. I was a proud Jew. I was brought up to be a Jew, but I hadn't really considered it. The Labour Jew hatred crisis. So the Labour Jew hatred crisis really started in 2015 when Jeremy Corbyn became the leader of the opposition party in Britain. And he is a racist. He hates Jewish people. And he is a modern expression of this leftist Jew hatred that really focuses on Israel. And I joined Twitter to take part in a fight against him because I knew what he was saying was wrong. I knew his vilification of Israel was wrong. And I knew that it was rooted in Jew hatred. I knew that it wasn't really just criticism of Israel, which is what he kind of purported. And I saw two things during this fight. The first is I saw the British Jewish community be a beacon of Jewish pride. We stood up, we said enough is enough, we wouldn't shut up, we kept on talking, we kept on advocating, and we kept on defending ourselves. And it was remarkable. You know, you had Orthodox rabbis, Reform rabbis, liberal rabbis publishing letters together as one, talking about Corbyn. The community came together as one, for the most part, because I also saw Jews, particularly on the left, particularly high-profile Jews, who were not able to call the situation for what it was, which was racism. They would say, well, you know, Corbyn, he's not a friend of the Jews, but he's not a racist, he's not a Jew hater, he's not that bad, it'll be okay. And I realized they were suffering from internalized anti-Jewishness. I realized that they were suffering from the hangover of the keep your head down policy, which was really the unofficial policy in the Jewish world of keep your head down, don't say anything, just get on with it. And these all of these experiences came together, and I realized we need a pride movement. We deserve a pride movement. We deserve to feel proud of who we are, because the non-Jewish world tries to make us feel shame. They impose their shame on us, their perspectives on our identity. And that leads us to feel a certain way about ourselves. And that's one of the tragedies of Jew hatred. It's not just what is done to us, it's how we internalize those ideas. And Jewish pride really seeks to reject the shame of Jew hatred, reject non-Jewish definitions of what it means to be a Jew, because we get to decide. The non-Jewish world do not get to tell us who we are. They do not get to define our experiences. And that is what Jewish pride is. That is where it came from. And I'm really proud to say, I hate using the word pride or proud right now because it's kind of my MO at the moment, but I'm really proud to say that it has become a global movement. I just did an event actually an hour ago with a youth organization. There were Jews from Argentina, Jews from Australia, Jews from Canada, North America, from the United States, and they were all feeling pride. They were all expressing pride and rejecting shame and rejecting non-Jewish definitions of Jewish identity.
So how does the modern state of Israel fit into your concept of Jewish pride and this Jewish pride movement that you're building?
It is absolutely central to it. It's our home. One of the things about Jewish pride is recognizing reality. And I know that what I'm about to say can be very difficult for particularly American Jews to understand, because I think the American Jewish experience is different to the British Jewish experience. I'm a British Jew, I'm a British person, but I'm a Jew. I'm a Jew first and foremost, and Israel is the homeland of the Jews. It is the state of the Jews. And this is not about Jew loyalty. This is what the non-Jewish world says. This is us as Jews having connections to the country where we live, the country where we might have been born, but also having a connection to our state, to our indigenous land. And, you know, we're celebrating here the 74th birthday of Israel. I love it because no other country talks about birthdays. We talk about Independence Day as an anniversary. In Israel, we talk about birthdays, which I love. And I think the slogan this year was 74 years young, 3,000 years old. That is our indigenous land. That is the land in which we came. That is the land in which we developed our civilization. And every kind of cultural iteration that emerged, Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, Sephardic, Bet Israel, they were iterations of our indigenous civilization. And the fact that we have reclaimed our land, it is the greatest decolonization project in the history of the world. It has never happened before that a group expelled, ethnically cleansed, genocided for thousands of years was able to reclaim their indigenous land. So Israel is absolutely central to Jewish pride. It is also one of the major conduits for modern Jew hate, but we're so much more than just what we experience. We're so much more than hate. And Israel is, it's what Matan said, Israel is a miracle. It's central, and I think it's really important that we put boundaries in place with Jewish pride, one of which being we're not going to debate the existence of the state of Israel. It is the Jewish state and the Jewish homeland, and it exists, period.
I actually am I know that we discussed some of these questions a little bit, or we exchanged some thoughts in advance, but I'm going to veer a little because you said some interesting things before I pass it on to Willie here. It's interesting, a lot of the language you used about what Israel is for the Jewish people, the greatest decolonization effort in history, reclaiming our indigenous land, that's taking a lot of quote unquote progressive terminology that's used really to criticize and condemn and, delegitimize Israel, and kind of talking it back at them. And is that something that you've consciously, you consciously articulate, or is that just, what organically, came to you?
It's a little bit of both. I mean, it's definitely a conscious choice. And I love doing it because it is, as you say, using the terminology which is common to kind of that part of the political spectrum and demonstrating how it applies to us. I mean, that's the most important. We can't use these kind of terms if they don't apply to us, but we are indigenous to that land. I mean, there's no set definition of indigeneity, but the United Nations has kind of a list of criteria, and we fit all of them. The Tibetans, after they were expelled from Tibet, they were coming to Israel, they were speaking to Israel, and they were saying, how have you done this? How have you maintained your culture? How have you retaken your land, taken back your land? And I think that it is definitely a conscious choice, but it has to fit. And I love it. It does give me great pleasure because they do use these kind of terms and this terminology against us. But actually, it to me highlights the absolute glaring and shocking hypocrisy of the left, because these terms do apply to us. And I know that some Jews, even when Willie was reading my extensive bio, which was a little embarrassing sitting here hearing that being read, you mentioned diversity, equity, and inclusion. A lot of people are scared of that because that again is being used against us. But the way I do it is reclaiming our story, is talking about the Jewish experience. And I think it's important not to kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater, but I also think it's important kind of not to misidentify. And I know that there are some Jews who say, oh, we're not indigenous, or we can't use that term. That's like boo hockey. It is our experience, and we're not going to let their perceptions of our experience impact how we understand ourselves. If we're not indigenous, then we're not going to use that term, but we are. And the fact that we were expelled for 2,000 years, it's insane. And we reestablished a state in the exact same land. When I show my students a map of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah and the map of the modern state of Israel, it's the same land. It is a miracle, and it is decolonization, despite what they say.
Willie, I'll turn it over to you.
All right, Ben, thank you. So I too read your book, and one of the comments that gripped me early on, and one that I could personally identify with, sadly, was when you wrote, and these are your words, "I am a progressive gay Jew, and I believe in progressive values, but because of my Jewishness and my belief in a Jewish state, I am no longer welcome in many left-wing spaces." This did hit me like a train, and it was uncomfortable to read because I too, after thinking about it, have been, quietly, though not always, shunned away or shunned out of conversations or spaces created for, the LGBTQ plus community or progressive causes. And this has been hurtful to me, and it has to you as well. And one of the reasons that my Jewish identity is often ahead of my gay identity. And furthermore, my husband just returned back from his first trip to Israel, which he described as life-changing in a great way, but has already faced criticism upon his return from there. So I guess all of that aside, I'm asking for those who may not have had the opportunity to read your book, but do identify as progressives and, whether they're LGBTQ or not, how can we demonstrate our Jewish pride and our support for the Jewish state, being Israel, to our progressive friends, allies, etc.? What is the argument, and what are your talking points?
So for me, it's really just about living those values. I would say that I'm no longer part of the progressive world, but my values are still progressive because their treatment of me, their rejection of me because of my Zionism and my Jewishness doesn't impact how I feel about myself. So it doesn't make me automatically voting for one party or another. And this is really the kind of crux of Jewish pride. It's about not letting the noise impact how we feel about ourselves and the space that we occupy in the world. With regards to progressive values, I do think it's helpful to use language that they understand. So referring back to Don's question, that is where the kind of purposeful utilization of words like indigenous, ethnic cleansing, decolonization are useful, because also it's just the modern context. We often talk about our expulsion from Israel 2,000 years ago. What does that mean? What does it mean to be expelled? Okay, the reality is, per our modern understanding, is we were ethnically cleansed. If we talk about the expulsion of Jews from England in 1290, that was an ethnic cleansing. And I think using language, again, only if it fits, but using language that people understand is incredibly helpful. But I will also say that we don't necessarily have a responsibility to change their minds. That is their work. We're going to fight. We're going to reclaim our dignity. We're going to fight to keep Jew hatred at bay. And of course, we're going to fight to encourage allies to come to our cause. But in those conversations, we really have to make sure that the people we're engaging with operate on good faith. And there's no shame in online blocking people. There's no shame in leaving a conversation if the person is not open, because that ultimately comes from a perception that they understand our experience better than we do. We are the best tellers of our own story. So in conversations with non-Jewish people, progressive or not, I would expect them to be respectful of that and to ask clarifying questions and to say, okay, I totally understand, or I heard this, what is the situation? It's okay to question, but this idea that people in the progressive world tell us what our experience is, that they talk about the fact that Israel is pinkwashing when it is the second best place or one of the two best places in Asia and the best place in the Middle East to be an LGBTQ plus person. That is true. And their opinion is rooted in Jew hatred. And yes, we obviously want to change their minds, but we can't engage in these conversations to our own detriment. But I think the most important thing is holding your values true. They cannot make me change how I feel about the world. They cannot make me not support other minority groups or my own community, or they cannot make me see Israel as something other than it is. And I think holding that candle inside us and keeping that candle lit, even if there's wind coming at it, is vitally important, but it is devastating. I worked, as I'm sure you did, and many, many other LGBTQ plus people did. We work incredibly hard to feel comfortable with our identities. I told you that story. I had really ill mental health, and I worked incredibly hard to be a proud gay man. And I don't really feel comfortable anymore in LGBTQ plus spaces. And that is devastating. But like anything else, their rejection of me, their hatred of me because of my Jewishness and my Zionism, it doesn't make me straight. It's not a form of conversion therapy. I'm still a gay man. I'm still a proud gay man. I'm still a proud Jew, a proud Zionist, and nothing they do can make me feel any different. I just think that they are betraying their own values.
It's not the most optimistic
No, I'm sorry, guys.
answer, but it is. I do appreciate it.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I mean, at school, I'm for teaching depressing classes. And it's true, we have to face our reality. I think that we have become, as the Jewish people, a people of denial. And it's not because we're ignorant, it's not because of any nefarious things, it's because we're trying to cope with unbelievable prejudice, historically and in a current form. And when we try to cope, sometimes we bury our heads in the sand. And we have to wake up to our reality, but we have to have the freeing realization that we've done nothing wrong. This is the non-Jewish world's problem with us. We need to build Jewish pride. We need to build barriers to their hate. We need to love ourselves regardless of what they're saying about us or doing to us. And although, the ADL published a report, and the World Zionist Organization and the Jewish Agency all published reports that said 2021 was the worst year in a decade for Jew hatred. That's scary. But I also feel that we're at a time of such immense excitement because of these conversations that Jews all over the world are coming to Jewish pride, and we're saying, no, we're not going to accept this. We're not going to allow you with your hatred to make us feel differently about ourselves. So it is pessimistic. I absolutely am pessimistic, but not with us, not with our community. I think that we have an incredible opportunity here to rebuild our people, to continue going forward, to make sure the Jewish people survive for thousands of more years with pride.
So, Ben, one of the interesting portions of your book is you interview 7 people, Jewish people, who have, something in common, but also are very different. You talk about the diversity of the Jewish community a lot through the book. And one of them that really I found very interesting was this Ethiopian woman who's, I think, in her early 30s, an Ethiopian Jewish woman, and moved to Israel at the age of 1 year old. And, she's very proud of Israel and a Zionist, but she also is very I think she promotes what Zionism really is to her out in the diaspora and in the non-Jewish world. But at the same time, she fights for equal rights for her Ethiopian Jewish community in Israel. But I wanted to just read one statement that I felt was very interesting that she made related to some of the things you've said. She said, if we allow something like Zionism, which is so fundamental to the Jewish experience, to be stolen from us and warped into something evil, then we have failed to take hold of our own destiny as Jews. And I just found that to be a very powerful statement. And I'm interested in how that, what you think of that statement and how it fits into, Jewish pride.
I mean, Ashagar is an amazing advocate for the Jewish community. She's an incredibly proud member of the Bet Israel community, and she is absolutely right. And we as Jews have to go back to school. And I am an educator, I'm a teacher, and I run kind of educational courses for people. And a lot of people say, why didn't we know this? And I think that we have not necessarily done the best job as a community, as a people, of making sure that we are educated. And one of the things we have to understand is that Zionism is an inherent Jewish concept. Yes, Zionism in a modern context emerged in the 19th century with Theodor Herzl and others, but it has been part of the Jewish story for millennia. If we think about the Babylon or the Jews who were exiled to Babylon after 586 BCE, I always get that mixed up, before the Common Era, they were sitting by the rivers of Babylon weeping. Return me to Zion. If I forget Zion, then cut my tongue out. That is Zionism. When the Sephardic Jews were building synagogues and said, may God speedily rebuild Jerusalem, that is Zionism. We have to understand that it is a fundamental Jewish concept. We were a nation. Before the 19th century, before the French made us sever our nationhood in order to fit their kind of ideas of a modern nation state following the French Revolution, we were a nation, Am Yisrael. And where was our land? It was the land of Israel. And we had independent kingdoms. We had the kingdom of Israel, the joint kingdom. We had the kingdom of Judah, the kingdom of Israel later on. We had the Hasmonean dynasty. We have had sovereignty in our land. Zionism is the desire for self-determination once again in our land. And as I said, while it came about in the 19th century, it is a fundamental part of the Jewish experience. What do we say at Pesach? It's just been Passover Pesach. L'shana haba'ah b'Yerushalayim. Next year in Jerusalem. That is Zionism. And what the non-Jewish world does is they define our identity for us. They take our identity and they twist it and they try to make us conform. And they have taken Zionism and they have bastardized it. They have made it something evil. They have made it a form of colonialism. They've made it akin to Nazism. And it is not true. We have to reclaim Zionism. We have to reclaim our experience, our identity, and reject their definitions because, quite frankly, their definitions are false. Because their world is built on Jew hatred. So how can we trust them to accurately define our experience? And what Ashagar has said is absolutely true. If we allow them internally, if we allow them to impact how we feel about Zionism, then yes, we have failed. I used to say, my second book, as you mentioned, Willie, is coming out in October. It's about internalized anti-Jewishness, commonly referred to self-hate. And I used to say, I'm Zionist, but. What does that mean, I'm Zionist, but? It means that in some way, I'm trying to qualify my Zionism to make my Zionism acceptable to the world. No, I don't do that anymore. I say I'm Zionist, full stop. And Ashagar is amazing, and she could not be more right.
Don, do you have a follow-up before I ask my next question?
Go ahead, Willie.
Okay,
Thank
so,
you, Ben.
yeah, Ben, thank you. And I apologize. Some of my questions come with a lot of sort of history of my own, but it was, it really made me think. And, I can share a lot of your experiences. So, so here's my other question, and it could be slightly related, to my first question, but it has to do with the portion of the book that you had on Jewish social justices and the challenges, or as you caution, as you later state, that you believe need to accompany that. So you write, it is worth noting the Jews who advocate for wider social justice, which you make clear you agree with and you support, that's what you have said, and who use Jewish values to promote their advocacy should do so with caution. Social justice-minded Jews should be aware that historically, Jews who have stood with other communities have sometimes been targeted by these same communities they supported. This is me, as a self-proclaimed progressive who grew up in a reformed and Reconstructionist home where advocacy and social justice in our home were basically synonymous with the way we practice Judaism, I had a really hard time reading this. I could feel myself getting sort of physically uncomfortable, even though, I was by myself reading this. But then when I continued to think about it, sadly, I think you're correct on this, and especially in this heightened stage of anti-Semitism and specifically anti-Zionism, which I often find indistinguishable from anti-Semitism. So what brought me to this, and as Matan said, a year and a day ago, the rockets started raining down on Israel. And shortly after those rockets started raining down on Israel, there were, pogrom-style beatings of Jews in streets in cities across the country, LA, Chicago, New York. And our federation hosted a stand-up against anti-Semitism rally at the Capitol and asked other minority and religious groups, and their leaders to join us. And shockingly, or not so shockingly, we were denied many times. And it was probably because of their movement or community's anti-Israel beliefs. And there are also, to your point, sadly, many Jews who failed to show up for this rally as well. So here's my question. How can we be both? If we can be both, can you be an advocate for social justice and an advocate for the state of Israel? And how can we show our support for Jewish pride while also acknowledging others and our own, perhaps, criticism of Israel? And what do you do? And that's a lot of information, but I was sitting there like, reading this.
I think we have to live in truth. And I think that we should support other communities. I want the Jewish community to support the LGBTQ plus community, in spite of what the LGBTQ plus community is doing or saying about Jews in Israel, right? We do have a responsibility because we're people. We're all in this earth, and every single individual, every life matters. Every single individual deserves to feel safe and secure and comfortable. But I think we live in truth. So I obviously advocate for the LGBTQ plus community, but I'm not going to not talk about their Jew hatred. Similarly with the Black community, I'm going to support, Black lives and Black civil rights, but I'm not going to stay silent when we see Jew hatred coming from the Black community. And just as they shouldn't stay silent with us, right? If they're seeing issues in our community, it's about being in truth and being sensitive. Of course, if I'm going to criticize the LGBTQ plus or the Black or any other community, I've got to make sure I've got responsibility to make sure that I'm not kind of accidentally sliding into forms of prejudice of my own, right? Because the most important thing to remember is no community, no individual is immune from prejudice. Whether you're a minority, whether you're on the left, you're just as prone to prejudice as anyone else. And each of us have to do the work to look inside ourselves and engage in introspection. So I think it's absolutely possible to be a Zionist, a proud Jew, and to support other communities. But one thing I will say is that I'm not going to support a community, or I'm not going to necessarily support an individual who is actively harming my community. We are allowed to center Jewish people. And this idea that we're not has been around for thousands of years, but really came into kind of overdrive in the 19th century after the Enlightenment. And we were told your specificity is against universality. When you defend Jews, when you're specifically Jews, you are harming the universal. And we believed it, like many, many Jews did over the centuries, and people still believe it today. They feel, we're not allowed to center Jewish people. We're not allowed to talk about just Jews. I'm a Jew, so the people who occupy my kind of advocacy are unsurprisingly Jews. I don't hate on or criticize a Black person who prioritizes Black people in their advocacy. We're allowed to prioritize our own experience. And we do have to recognize the harsh reality that often the communities that we're going to be advocating for may not necessarily support us in return. And each person has an individual choice to make whether they continue support or not, and how that support looks, But I do think we're allowed to center Jews. It's okay. We're Jews. We're the most continuously persecuted minority group in the history of the world. We're allowed to center ourselves in our own advocacy. In fact, we must. That doesn't mean we don't support other communities. I will show up personally for women with what's happening with Roe versus Wade. And regardless of what your opinions are with that, that's my personal perspective, right? And I'm going to show up for that. But I'm not going to decenter Jews from my advocacy. I'm not going to, feel ashamed of advocating for Jews, because being Jewish is compatible with being a universal person. There is a balance between universality and specificity. It is the non-Jewish world who says there is not. And we can criticize our own, we can criticize our own community. My publisher is a publisher in the UK that was created to specifically deal with left-wing Jew hatred. And they've currently been doing work on get refusal. So the idea that, you know, a Jewish divorce is a get, and sometimes women are denied get, so they can't remarry in a synagogue. So my publisher has been doing work on that. That is not anti-Jewish. We're allowed to criticize. We're allowed to hope for better and to promote, you know, values which we think the Jewish world should be following. But we shouldn't feel guilty for centering ourselves. I'm sorry. We are the most continuously persecuted people in the persecuted minority group in the history of mankind. It's insanity if we don't advocate for ourselves. I mean, it's literal insanity. We're allowed to do that, and we're allowed to support other people in ways that we choose. And we're also allowed to put distance, and we're also allowed to say, actually, I'm not going to engage with this figure or this specific organization because they're problematic for Jews. And that's okay, because every group has that right.
I'm sitting here listening to you talk about Zionism and talk about personal Jewish pride, and really it's almost like you're talking about a personal Zionism when you're talking about Jewish pride, because, you know, Zionism, as you said, is a Jewish movement for self-determination. It's a liberation movement. And you're really, when you're talking about individual Jewish pride, I think that's the way you talk about it is liberating.
Yeah.
And it's almost like a personal liberation, a personal Zionism.
Absolutely, that's exactly right. Because we have been told for thousands of years what we are. We've been forced to define ourselves via non-Jewish expectations of our experience and identity. And Zionism was the attempt to kind of reclaim our land, literally. And Jewish pride is an attempt to reclaim our destiny. We deserve to feel pride, just like any other community. And many communities have their pride movements. The Black community obviously have theirs, the LGBTQ plus community, and we're allowed to have others, and we deserve ours because we're a miracle. We've survived for thousands of years. We have thrived. We have a beautiful, distinct civilization to honor and to develop. And it is our responsibility. That's really our great work as Jewish pride. The non-Jewish world's work is combating Jew hatred. We participate in that fight, but even Jewish pride tells us that we can participate. It tells us, actually, I'm allowed to center myself. So I'm not going to allow a non-Jewish person or a non-Jewish movement define my experience or define my identity. And we have work to do. This isn't just inherent knowledge, right? Jews have to learn. We need to understand who and what we are. And by that, we really have to study. Not necessarily we all need to go to yeshiva, but we need to become kind of like well-versed in Jewish history to an extent. But it's incredible. And I think really, ultimately, it's just not caring. It's not that they can say what they want, because we're going to combat, we're going to fight, we're going to reclaim our story. But internally, their words don't make me feel any less proud. I published a tweet yesterday that got a lot of a negative attention, and I woke up with lots of DMs wishing me dead. And I was just like, how pathetic. I'm going to put on my kippah, and I'm going to go out into Hong Kong, and I'm going to feel proud in my Jewishness. And their racism, their hatred doesn't make me feel any different. Because it's internal. This is a collective thing for us as a people, but also for us internally as individuals.
Willie, did you have a question?
No, do you have a follow-up? I can wait.
Well, I just have one question I want to ask, then I'll turn it over to you about the diaspora. Just, you know, Israel, not just at this moment in time, but including this moment in time, but also just through its existence the last 74 years, you know, talk about your thoughts of kind of the interplay between Israel and the diaspora and the role that Israel might play, and it may have changed over time for the diaspora.
I think that, kind of as I said at the beginning, it's our home. I've always spoken about Israel as we. Even growing up in Scotland with my Scottish accent, I talk about we, because I really feel that. Last year, when bombs were raining, when rockets were raining down Ashkelon and Ashdod and Tel Aviv, it was, you know, I wasn't there, but this was my home this was happening to, because we are a family, and that is our home. And, you know, I like being from the UK. I certainly am to an extent culturally British. I love queuing. I love hierarchy. I love order and all of those things. But I'm also a Jew. I said this at the beginning, and it's really important that we become comfortable with our difference. That is something the non-Jewish world has made us feel very uncomfortable with. So we want to shed it. We want to become fully American or fully British. And we can be fully British and fully American with the understanding that we're also an other. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. The non-Jewish world makes it a bad thing. So Israel has to be central to Jewish pride. It has to be central, I think, to the Jewish identities of diaspora. And not just, I know in America, there was this kind of idea of financial support. American Jews really expressed their Zionism in many ways through financially supporting Israel, which is, thank God they did, right? But it has to be more than that. It has to be how we feel connected to that land. That is our home. I taught a class at the beginning of this year, and I showed the students a kind of broken piece of pottery that had a menorah that was found 3,000 years ago in the ground in Israel. And then I showed them this shelf. And I was like, look at the continuity. That is my home. And yes, while I'm Scottish, and yes, while I wore a kilt to my bar mitzvah and my siblings' weddings, and that's fun and cute, there's so much more to me than that. And I think that we have to become comfortable with our difference. And a lot of Jews are uncomfortable with that, and I understand why. We have been othered because of our difference. We've been made to feel different. We've been made to feel like a foreign other. But just like other diasporic communities around the world, they have to be comfortable with the dual identities they have, so do we. And this is not dual loyalty. It is perfectly natural to have connections to a number of different places. I am a Zionist, I'm a Jew, I have a deep connection to Israel, it's my home. I'm also British. I'm a British Jew, and that is okay. We cannot let them shame us into distancing ourselves, because when they say, well, you have dual loyalty, we say, no, we don't. We don't have dual loyalty. We're loyal to Britain. We're loyal to America. Actually, we should say, I am loyal to Israel. I'm a Jew, and I'm also a British person. And why do you think that those are incompatible? And the answer is conspiracy, fantasy, Jew hatred, because these are not standards imposed to any other community. And my hope for the diaspora is that we strengthen our Jewish pride and we strengthen our connection to Israel in the fullest understanding of what that means. Not just going to Tel Aviv and partying, although that is fantastic, of course, but understanding that is our home. It's where we emerge. It's where we were born.
Okay, so I had one last question. I know we're getting close to time, and then we do have some questions that people have typed in. So, my last question was, what is the connection between Jewish pride and Israel? And you answered that, at least in your view. And but is there, from where you're sitting, can you differentiate the two? Is it possible to differentiate the two?
Yeah, I mean, for sure. I didn't vote in the election. Israel and it is complicated, and we have to have discussions about this complication. Israel is our home, it's our indigenous land, but it's also a sovereign state. And we have to kind of come to terms with that difference, because it is a bit complicated. And we have to understand and interact with that complication. And I think it's absolutely possible. I think that sometimes Zionist or diaspora Jews need to maybe sit some discussions out, because they don't necessarily apply to us. Just as I think that some Israelis sometimes need to understand our experience. It does go both ways, right? We have experiences that they don't have, but they also have experiences that we also don't. And I think that there is a tension there between, indigeneity and being a diasporic community. And we have to continue this discussion. And it is, and I'm not necessarily here to have all the answers. We need to talk about this together as a community. But I do think for sure there can be complication there. But Israeli government policy doesn't make me feel any less proud of Israel, because governments come and go. But that is our land, that is our historic land, it's our land today. And I feel deeply proud of it and deeply connected to it. And I think understanding that makes it slightly easier. And a government is going to make a decision. I also feel like happy to be British. And the British government does stuff all the time that, I'm not like, oh, I can't be proud of Britain any longer. It's like, there's layers to this, and we need to start interacting with it in a very honest way and not being in denial anymore, not burying our heads in the sand, confronting these things, because it's really This first book is Rebuilding a People. The second book is Reclaiming Our Story, because we need to do that. Our story is ours and we need to interact with it so we can understand it and process it. And there are complications. To be diasporic is complicated.
Thank you. Okay, we have a few questions. We have a more difficult one, but I feel, and then we have some other ones. So let's swallow the frog first. What is, here's a question, Ben, and feel free to answer this how you think you can.
Okay.
What might be the implications of your concept of Jewish pride or Zionism for the Arab Israelis, or even, the Palestinians in the West Bank?
So with regards to Arab citizens of Israel, they should be and are equal citizens. Israel is a Jewish state, but just as Britain, let's remind you all, Britain's a Christian country and I have full civil rights there. So that is that is completely fine. We should work to end, anti-Arab prejudice, which absolutely exists. We need to have those conversations like any country should. With regards to the citizens of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, we need to be very honest here. And this is a change I have noticed in the Jewish kind of advocacy space. Our conversation is changing, to be honest, and actually so is the Palestinian. The Palestinian kind of argument is becoming much more honest, and we're seeing people come out and say, yeah, we want all of the land. We don't want a two-state solution, we want all of the land. Fine, okay, at least you're being honest. We need to be honest about that, to be quite frank. And I think that we, trying to be good Zionists, trying to be good Jews, trying to be understanding, we've been incredibly diplomatic. And we have to be very clear that Zionism in no way precluded the existence of an Arab state or a Palestinian state. Actually, they could have existed side by side 74 years ago. Let's be very clear on that. Who said no to the United Nations partition? It was the Arab governments. Who walked away in the 1990s? It was the Palestinian leadership. And I'm not here to blame the Palestinian people for that. These were decisions made by governments, but we have to be very clear and very honest about why there isn't a Palestinian state right now. And we have to be very clear and say, actually, Zionism, regardless about the different perspectives on Zionism that were emerging in the 10s and the 20s and 30s, because there were absolutely Zionist perspectives that wanted all of the land, right? For sure. But there was a partition. The Jews said yes, the Arabs said no. So in terms of what implication Jewish pride has for the citizens of the Palestinian Authority or territory, it doesn't really have any. We could have partitioned the land. We were happy to do that. And we have to be honest about this. We cannot pretend any longer. And we have to be critical of our own governments, of our own sides, of our own ideologies when appropriate. But when people are shouting in New York City saying, from the river to the sea, we want all the land, we need to recognize that fact. And it doesn't help the Palestinian people to deny the fact that the reason they don't have a state is because of their own governments, their own leadership. And that's just a fact. We can criticize Israel, we can have conversations about the settlements, we can have conversations about a lot of things, but it doesn't take away from the fact that a Jewish state could have been living side by side with an Arab state for the last 74 years. So that is the theory. Practically speaking, again, I think that we really have to come to the table. But to have a conversation, it's a two-way thing. So we need to have people to come to the table with. Hopefully the Palestinian leadership will do that. And we should be, getting to that point. I believe in the creation of a Palestinian sovereign state. But actually Zionism had really no implications for the establishment of an independent Palestine. Because let's recall, there has never been an independent Palestine in history. And I'm not saying that to delegitimize their claim. I'm saying that because that is historically accurate. It was ruled by the British between 18 and 48, and then before that, it was ruled by the Ottomans. So yes, we want to establish a Palestinian state because they're there and they deserve that, but that could have happened a long time ago, and we have to point to the reasons that it didn't.
Thank you. Don, do you have a follow-up before I'm okay, we have one more question. I realize we're actually over our 60 minutes, but give us a few more minutes. We have a question dealing with, you wrote about traditions and Jewish culture thriving. And it was actually a really nice piece. I identified with it as well. And, you know, personally, I can throw in too, you know, we've seen from the recent Pew study that, you know, institutional Jewish life was sort of hemorrhaging, you know, connection and participants and everything. But as you've been talking about Jewish pride and you've been making the case for it and traveling around, what examples have you seen? Can you give on ways that we can engage and connect people Jewishly to sort of enhance this idea? And I ask selfishly too, as you know, the head of the Federation, you know, what, you know, this is a $1 billion question across at least our country,
Yeah.
across the diaspora. So, you know, what people want to know, what can we do?
I think what you're doing is amazing, and what you did with the fires was amazing, and the connection that you're building, you know, with your sister city of Ashkelon, and maintain the connection you're maintaining is amazing. I think one of the biggest problems is education, and this is really not specific to you guys. This is specific to the whole Jewish world. We have kind of dropped the ball, I think. Education is our lifeblood. It's how we continue the Jewish people. And the fact that there are Jews who do not understand that we're, whether you like the word indigenous or not, the fact that we came from Israel, the land of Israel, that is a real problem. The fact that people don't necessarily understand that Yiddish culture, Sephardic, Mizrahi, Bet Israel, were iterations of our original indigenous culture, that is a problem. That people see our history through a veil of tears. It's just the Shoah, it's just the pogroms of the Farhud. It's education. We have to educate people about where we came from, the incredible miracle that we are, that we thrived culturally while experiencing untold persecution. It's vital. I was teaching a class, again, I keep talking about this class. I was teaching a class called The Story of the Jews, and one of the teacher tools is to show a video. If you don't really want to make a lesson on something, or you know, explain something fully, you get a video. I couldn't find any videos on Jewish indigeneity. That's a problem. The fact that there are no resources, or there's not very many resources out there about this subject that teaches us historically. And it's not about disregarding the biblical stories, because actually many of them are kind of based on truth. But what do we know for certain? We know that the word Israel was first mentioned on the Mernip Tasteli 3,300 years ago. Okay, what can we know from that? Well, the Egyptians, obviously, well, the whole Mernip Tasteli is a celebration of an Egyptian victory. And we know from this engraving that we were clearly established enough to warrant a mention. That is something Jews should know. When did we emerge? What was our system of government? When did the monotheistic aspect of Judaism emerge? We should know this. So I think education is absolutely vital, because people are crying out for knowledge. And people are getting a lot of knowledge from social media, which is not the place to get knowledge. You know, it can help for sure, but we have to be kind of creating mini courses. We have to be creating like many online schools for people that allow people to engage accessibly. This is not necessarily academic, but it's about helping people understand historically who and what we are. And, you know, do people know that we purposefully shed our nationhood to be accepted by societies like France or America? Do they know that? I'd say probably not. And that's important. That's a really important piece of the puzzle, because then that will inform how they feel about themselves and how they classify Judaism and Jewishness. So I think across the board, we have to recommit ourselves to education, but through the lens of Jewish pride. Jewish pride isn't just a global movement. It is a pair of glasses, a pair of spectacles that we put on that helps us see our experience clearly, that helps us understand the Jewish students in the 19th century who created a society that taught Jewish history while teaching self-defense. That is incredible. It's inspiring to us. There's so much Jewish history, and no person can become an expert in it all, of course, but we have to become well-versed in our kind of maybe more general story, and that can only be done through education.
Thanks, Ben. Thank you. Don, do you have any? We're gonna wrap up here.
I just wanted to thank you, Ben, for your knowledge and your ideas and your energy. And I have a bunch of more questions, and hopefully you'll come back someday and we'll ask them again. But thanks for sharing all your ideas with the Jewish community in Sacramento.
Thank you so much for having me.
Ben, ditto. And I actually want to turn it back over to our president, Bruce Palmer. Oh, Bruce, you're muted. Oh, I think we lost Bruce. Oh,
can tell Bruce isn't on social media.
Okay, here we go.
There you go.
Well, Willie and Don, thank you so much for facilitating such a worthwhile discussion. And Ben Freeman, thank you so much. What you said, the words I can think are enlightening, profound, exhilarating, and liberating. Thank you so much for bringing your wisdom to this discussion. We really appreciate it. You've given us a lot of food for thought as we move forward, and we hope to hear from you again sometime in the future. That's our program for tonight. Want to thank you all for being with us and have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone.